They arrested him without proof, rushed him through the system, and slapped a $10,000 bail on him. But one phone call changed everything. The late summer air was thick and stifling as Jamal Reynolds stepped outside, the sun pressing down like a weight. He had one simple task: grab a Gatorade from Jim's Corner Mart and get back home before his mom called to check in. 10 minutes. Tops. Jamal wasn't one to linger outside, especially around here. Not because the neighborhood was unsafe, but because eyes followed him differently than they did his classmates from Rockford High. Being a 16-year-old black kid in a mostly white suburb meant walking a fine line. He knew the unspoken rules. Keep your hands visible, don't linger, don't run, don't give them a reason. As he stepped into the store, the blast of air conditioning wrapped around him like relief. The place was small, packed with shelves of chips and sodas, and carried the stale scent of old coffee. Mr. Jim, the owner, barely glanced up from his newspaper. A white man in a polo stood near the counter, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the aisles. Jamal headed straight for the fridge, grabbed a blue Gatorade, and made his way to the register. But just as he passed the snack aisle, movement caught his eye, a guy in a black hoodie stuffing candy bars into his pockets. He was quick, eyes darting toward the front. Before Jamal could react, the hoodie-clad guy took off. The door barely had time to swing open before the store alarm blared through the air. Jamal froze. Mr. Jim leaped up, cursing. The man by the counter spun toward the door, then turned sharply, his eyes locking onto Jamal instead. "You!" the man barked, stepping forward. Jamal's stomach twisted. Confused, he started to turn, but the man was already in his space, his grip tight on Jamal's arm. "Let me go." Jamal yanked back, his pulse hammering. The man's voice was firm, and before Jamal could react, he saw it, the badge clipped to his belt. An off-duty cop. A chill shot through his body. "The guy ran that way. It wasn't me." Jamal protested, eyes darting toward Mr. Jim, silently pleading for help. The store owner hesitated, his brow creased in uncertainty. But he said nothing. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. But the officer wasn't listening. With a rough shove, he forced Jamal against the counter, twisting his arms behind his back. "You think you're slick, huh?" the cop muttered. "I didn't do anything." Click. The cold steel of handcuffs clamped around his wrists. A few customers watched, some whispered, others pulled out their phones. But no one stepped forward. A siren wailed in the distance. Jamal's legs locked up. He knew this was bad. Really bad. And just like that, a quick trip for a Gatorade had turned into handcuffs, flashing lights, and a future spiraling out of control. But the worst part? No one cared to hear his side of the story. The ride to the station stretched on, longer than it should have. Jamal sat stiff in the back seat, his wrists aching, heart hammering like a drum. The officer, Detective Carl Brewer, had barely spoken since throwing him into the car. Just a clipped radio call, juvenile suspect in custody. Jamal wanted to scream, to make him listen. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. The police station was cold and colorless, smelling of sweat and old paper. The moment he stepped inside, another uniformed officer grabbed his arm, guiding him past rows of desks and ringing phones. His sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor. A tall, broad-shouldered officer glanced up from a clipboard. The badge on his chest read Sergeant Miller. "Shoplifting." Miller muttered, disinterested. Brewer nodded. "Got him at Jim's Corner Mart." Owner didn't see the act, but he was the only one near the shelf when the alarm went off. Jamal tensed. "That's not true. I was—" A sharp squeeze on his shoulder cut him off. Brewer's grip was firm, a silent warning. "Camera footage?" Miller asked. "Haven't checked yet," Brewer replied with a lazy shrug. "But the kid fits the description." Jamal's stomach twisted. Description. The real thief had been wearing all black, a hoodie pulled over his head. Jamal stood there in a gray t-shirt and basketball shorts. It didn't matter. Miller barely reacted. Just scribbled something on his clipboard and jerked his chin toward an open doorway. "Take him to processing." Jamal tried again, voice shaking but determined. I didn't steal anything. Check the cameras. Ask Mr. Jim. Brewer didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, he hauled Jamal into a small room where an officer waited with a camera. Mugshot. Fingerprints. Then a form slid across the table, his hands shaking as he signed it. The words glared back at him in bold print. Juvenile detention. Pending arraignment. Jamal's body felt disconnected, like he was watching all of this happen to someone else. They led him to a cold metal bench, replacing the cuffs with zip ties before leaving him there. The room wasn't a cell, just a holding area filled with other kids, all looking just as lost. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The longer he sat, the deeper the fear sank in. Did his mom even know where he was? She'd been working late all week. What if she called his phone and it went straight to voicemail? What if she thought he was just out with friends? A door creaked open. Jamal's head snapped up. A man in a wrinkled suit stepped in, looking exhausted and uninterested. Jamal Reynolds? He asked. Flipping through a stack of papers, the lawyer barely looked up. Jamal's throat went dry. Yeah. The man finally sat down, tapping a pen against the folder. You're being charged with shoplifting and resisting arrest. Jamal's chest tightened. That's not. I'm here to represent you for the arraignment, the lawyer cut in, already moving on. Your hearing is first thing in the morning. Morning. They were keeping him overnight. Panic clawed at his ribs. I didn't do anything, he whispered, desperation creeping into his voice. The lawyer let out a tired sigh, barely meeting his eyes. That's what they all say, kid. Jamal sank back against the bench, his heart pounding like a drum. For the first time, it really hit him. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They weren't going to listen. They were going to bury him. But tomorrow, everything would change. They just didn't know it yet. Jamal barely slept. The hard plastic bench left his back aching, and every time he shut his eyes, reality slammed into him all over again. By morning, the sound of metal clicking open jolted him awake. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway. Let's go, Reynolds. The walk to the courtroom was a blur, heavy doors, echoing footsteps, the bite of zip ties cutting into his wrists. His lawyer, he still didn't know the guy's name, strolled beside him, flipping through notes like he was skimming a book he hadn't read before. Jamal's stomach twisted. Courtrooms on TV were just drama. This was his life. Inside, the air was stale, thick with something unshakable. Rows of wooden benches stretched across the room, a few scattered faces watching with disinterest. And at the front, looming high like a throne, was the judge's bench. Judge Warren Kincaid. His lawyer had said the name like a warning, and now, standing here, Jamal understood why. Kincaid was an older white man with thin lips and sharp, unreadable eyes. The kind of man who didn't soften. Not even in moments of mercy. His black robe sat perfectly pressed. The gavel rested beside him like it had already made up its mind. Jamal swallowed hard. A young prosecutor in a suit that was a size too small stood up, shuffling his papers. Your Honor, the defendant was caught at the scene of a shoplifting incident. The store alarm was activated, and the arresting officer, Detective Carl Brewer, witnessed him attempting to flee. Jamal's head snapped up. That's a lie. I didn't. A firm grip clamped down on his arm. His lawyer leaned in, voice low. Don't talk unless I tell you to. Jamal's chest burned with frustration. Judge Kincaid barely acknowledged him. Does the prosecution have video evidence? The prosecutor shifted, hesitating. There is surveillance footage, Your Honor, but it hasn't been reviewed yet. Kincaid nodded slowly. Then we'll proceed without it. Jamal's breath hitched. Without it, Your Honor, Jamal's lawyer began, adjusting his tie. I request a postponement until the surveillance footage can be reviewed. Judge Kincaid lifted a hand, silencing him. Mr. Reynolds was at the scene. He resisted arrest. Officers had reason to believe he was guilty. That is sufficient to proceed. Jamal's legs wobbled beneath him. It was all moving too fast. And then, the words that sent an icy chill through his veins. The prosecutor leaned forward. Given the defendant's age, the state requests that he be tried as an adult. Jamal's stomach bottomed out. His lawyer hesitated. Your Honor, my client is 16. He has no prior record. A charge like this. But Kincaid was already shaking his head. We need to send a message. Crimes like this are not taken lightly in my courtroom. Jamal's hands went numb. Adult court. That meant real prison time. A felony record that wouldn't just disappear at 18. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was his reality. His eyes darted around the room, searching, hoping for his mother. She wasn't there. And in that moment, Jamal felt something he hadn't before. He was truly alone. Then, his lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Do you have family you need to call?" Jamal's lips parted. They had no idea. His throat tightened. He wanted to scream for them to check the footage. Roll the tape. Demand that someone, anyone, listen. But every time he tried to speak, the system moved faster than his words could catch up. Judge Kincaid leaned forward, fingers tapping against the bench. "Mr. Reynolds, you are being charged with theft and resisting arrest. Given the circumstances, I agree with the prosecution's recommendation." Jamal felt like the walls were closing in. His lawyer lifted a hand, his voice almost reluctant. "Your Honor, we request release under parental supervision while we build a proper defense." Kincaid barely reacted. Jamal wasn't a person. He was just another case file to be processed. "I don't see a parent present," Kincaid said, scanning the room. "That tells me everything I need to know." Jamal's pulse pounded. She didn't know. His mom would have been here in an instant. But she didn't even know he was missing. His lawyer cleared his throat. "Sir, my client is a minor. We can't assume negligence." Kincaid lifted a hand, cutting him off again. "I'll allow a preliminary bail hearing, but I am not inclined to be lenient." His gaze hardened. "This isn't the first time a young man has stood before me claiming innocence." Jamal's chest squeezed tight. It didn't matter what he said. Didn't matter what was true. This judge had already decided his future. The prosecutor shuffled his notes. "Your Honor, given the severity of the offense and the defendant's resistance during arrest, we request bail be set at $10,000. Jamal's breath caught. $10,000? For a bottle of Gatorade? His lawyer barely reacted. "That's excessive." Kincaid didn't blink. "Bail is set at $10,000. Next case." Jamal's legs locked up. It was over. Just like that. The gavel slammed down. Final, unforgiving. The officer behind him gripped his arm, pulling him toward the exit. His lawyer had already moved on to his next case. Flipping through files like Jamal was nothing more than another name on a docket. Jamal couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. His vision blurred as he was led through the side door, back toward the holding area. This was it. They were sending him away. Unless she found out. Jamal lifted his head, voice hoarse but steady. "Can I call my mom?" The officer didn't even glance at him. "You'll get one phone call when we get back." Jamal swallowed hard. His next words came slow, deliberate. "She's the U.S. Attorney General." The grip on his arm slackened. The words hit the room like a gunshot. The prosecutor's pen stopped mid-signature. His lawyer's head jerked up. Judge Kincaid's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers curled just a little tighter around the bench. And just like that, everything changed. A heavy silence fell over the room. Detective Brewer, the cop who had arrested him, stared at Jamal like he'd just spoken another language. The officer at his side let go of his arm completely. The public defender blinked. Wait, what? Jamal didn't just see the shift. He felt it. Judge Kincaid remained still, but the clench of his jaw, the flicker of tension in his eyes, something had shifted. Jamal took a breath, holding his ground. My mom, he said, voice unwavering, is the U.S. Attorney General. The prosecutor hesitated. And her name is... Jamal's lips curled into a humorless smile. They were scrambling now. Angela Reynolds. That name carried weight. It meant power. It meant oversight. And in a room full of people who had been so sure they could crush him without consequence, it meant trouble. The whispers started instantly. A court clerk shifted uncomfortably, stealing a glance at the judge. The bailiff, who hadn't spared Jamal a second look before, was now eyeing him carefully, seeing him differently. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his tone no longer as sure as before. Your Honor, given this new information, perhaps we should reassess the conditions of bail. For a long moment, Judge Kincaid didn't move. His fingers tapped against the bench. Once. Twice. Then, finally, he exhaled, leaning forward. You expect me to believe you're the son of the U.S. Attorney General? Jamal didn't flinch. I expect you to let me make my phone call. Silence. Then. Take him to holding, Kincaid snapped, flicking a hand toward the officer. We'll verify his claims. If he's lying, we proceed as planned. The officer grabbed Jamal's arm again, this time, far less certain. But it didn't matter. Because Jamal wasn't lying. And once that call went through, everything would change. 20 minutes later, Jamal sat in a small, windowless holding room. His hands rested on his lap, fingers still tingling from where the zip ties had bitten into his skin. But he barely noticed. Across from him, the officer who had been so eager to shove him through the system now sat stiffly, a phone pressed to his ear. He nodded too much. Too quickly. Yes, ma'am. A pause. Yes, he's safe. Another pause. Yes, Your Honor is still in the building. I'll let them know. Silence. Then, slowly, the officer lowered the phone. Jamal met his gaze head-on, unwavering. She's on her way, the officer said, voice stiff. Jamal just nodded. Outside the room, the courthouse was shifting. Conversations had turned hushed. Phones were ringing. Calls were being made. A quiet ripple of panic spread through the building as the realization sank in. They had just railroaded the wrong kid. And at the center of it all, Judge Kincaid sat behind his bench, fingers curled against the wood, jaw tight. For the first time. Uncertain, Kincaid leaned forward, schooling his expression. There was substantial cause for arrest, he said, his voice measured but firm. Angela didn't so much as blink. Substantial cause? Based on what? Kincaid's fingers tapped against the bench, a steady, calculated rhythm. The arresting officer had reason to believe. Angela cut him off with a single raised hand. Did you have evidence? Silence. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, flipping through his papers as if searching for something, anything, that would justify what had just happened. The young attorney finally cleared his throat. The footage hadn't been reviewed at the time of the arraignment, he admitted. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. So my son was arrested, detained, and had his bail set at $10,000 without a single shred of reviewed evidence? Kincaid's jaw tightened, but he held her gaze. The officer acted within his authority. Angela stepped forward, voice dropping into something dangerous. And you, Judge Kincaid? Did you? For the first time, he hesitated. The room was so quiet Jamal could hear his own breathing. He wasn't sure he'd ever seen someone hold their ground against a judge like that, especially one as cold and unmoving as Kincaid. Angela turned to the prosecutor. Dismiss the charges. Now. The young attorney paled, glancing at the judge. Kincaid didn't speak. He didn't have to. The power in the room had already shifted. The prosecutor cleared his throat again, voice stiff. Given the lack of reviewed evidence, the state withdraws the charges against Jamal Reynolds. Jamal exhaled, shoulders sagging. Just like that, it was over. Or at least, it should have been. Angela wasn't finished. She turned back to Kincaid, her gaze unreadable. I will be requesting a full investigation into your courtroom, your sentencing history, and your past rulings. Kincaid's face didn't change, but his fingers curled into a fist against the desk. Are you implying misconduct? Angela's smile was razor-sharp. I'm implying a pattern. One that's about to be broken. Jamal didn't know what victory was supposed to feel like, but this moment, felt close. The tension in the courthouse was suffocating. Jamal sat still, his pulse steady now. He wasn't afraid anymore, because he could feel it. The shift. The fear wasn't his anymore. It belonged to them. Beyond the closed door, the courthouse buzzed with frantic movement. Officers whispering, clerks making urgent calls, legal assistants exchanging uneasy glances. They had tried to bury him. Now, they were the ones scrambling to dig themselves out. Then, the door swung open. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking against the cold tile. Angela Reynolds, the U.S. Attorney General. Jamal's mother. She didn't hesitate. Didn't waste a second looking around. Her sharp eyes locked onto him immediately, scanning him, assessing him, not just as her son, but as someone who had been wronged. Then she turned to the officer still seated across from Jamal. Her voice was calm, steady, but it cut through the room like a blade. Uncuff him. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then moved fast, fumbling to undo the zip ties around Jamal's wrists. She stepped closer, reaching for his hands, checking his wrists for marks. Her jaw tightened. Then she turned, her attention now fully on the people who had dared to do this. Who's responsible? The officer swallowed hard. Ma'am, there was. Who? Silence. Then, another voice cut in. That would be me. Judge Kincaid stood in the doorway now, his robe pristine, his expression carefully neutral. But Jamal saw the tension in his posture, the way his fingers flexed at his sides. Angela Reynolds straightened, her power filling the room like a storm cloud rolling in. Then I'd like an explanation, Judge. Kincaid exhaled slowly, but Jamal could see it. He was grasping for control he no longer had. There was a theft, Kincaid started, his voice measured. A store alarm was triggered. The responding officer. Angela cut him off. The responding officer arrested my son without cause. Her words were sharp, slicing through whatever defense Kincaid had been preparing. She took a step forward. You railroaded a minor, denied him due process, and tried to push a felony charge without reviewing evidence. Did you even check the surveillance footage? Silence. Jamal didn't need to hear an answer. His mother already knew it. And so did everyone else. The courthouse, the system, the people who had treated him like he was nothing. They had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. And Angela Reynolds was about to make sure they paid for it.